Running Aces Casino and Racetrack is the Twin Cities' premier choice for exciting entertainment, 24/7 gaming and dining, monthly comedy shows, and $1 blackjack with no commission or ante, making it the most player-friendly casino around. Trout Air Tavern at Running Aces offers Minnesota-inspired handcrafted dishes with locally sourced ingredients and the trout that made the area famous. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, 25 minutes north of downtown. Visit runaces.com. Running Aces, your night out is waiting.
The following is a Podcast One Minnesota production.
For those who simply can't get enough talk about the Vikings, we present Bonus Chatter. Bonus chatter about your favorite team that's unscripted, unfiltered, and uninterrupted. This is another edition of 1500 ESPN's Purple Podcast.
Well, welcome to another Purple Podcast. Matthew Coller here with you, along with Arif Hasan of Zone Coverage. And this time he's not on the phone, he's in person here at the TCO Performance Center. Arif, how are you?
I'm good. I'm glad that the audio quality will be improved. The take quality will not be, but can't win them all.
Yeah, no, not at all. We got a lot of things to get your blazing hot takes on, or rather, your analysis, which is what you do at Zone Coverage, and it's very good, so people should check out your work. I want to start with Anthony Barr as a pass rusher. Now, after the 2016 season, I thought maybe there was a chance that the Vikings would make him into more of a pure pass rusher. And it didn't happen. Now, when Anthony Barr talked today, he alluded to that being a conversation in the past, but now they kind of want to commit to it more, of having him work on his pass rush moves against tackles and coming off the edge more often, which he didn't do a whole lot. I guess I'm really curious to see if Mike Zimmer is going to take a defense that was number one and make a lot of changes to it, or if he likes to experiment with things in training camp and then have us write about them and then have them never happen, right? I mean, which do you think it is? Do you think we will see the same Anthony Barr role, or will we see him in more five-down situations coming off the edge?
I think, well, in terms of the way Zimmer approaches things, it's a bit of both. I mean, we've seen the double A gap stuff kind of fade away, but very similar stuff kind of replace it. And the defense has been good, and it's been getting better in part because he's been kind of keeping ahead of how people might respond to what he does. So we're always going to see evolution. Now, whether or not that evolution is something that we see in training camp, I think we've seen stuff before in training camp where they do something interesting or fun on the offense and the defense, and we don't see it at all during the regular season. This one I wouldn't be surprised to see during the regular season, because kind of the core idea behind a lot of the double A gap stuff is that you get one-on-one matchups with your pass rushers. And having five down on the line and having Anthony Barr take on a tackle or something like that, that kind of further helps execute that idea. And it makes it very difficult for the quarterback to read kind of, what protections he should call and stuff like that. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that, and I would consider that kind of an evolution of a lot of the similar concepts, but I also wouldn't bank on it.
Where do you stand on Barr's value? Because that was sort of a debate going into training camp of which guy would you rather pay, Stephon Diggs or Anthony Barr? And, well, they've made it clear that the guy they were going to for sure lock up is Stephon Diggs. And I would tend to agree with them when it comes to the value of each player to their offense or defense, that Stephon Diggs brings you more value over another guy you could just get versus Anthony Barr. But I do think this is a guy in college who was a prolific pass rusher, and if all of a sudden this is something they start doing with him, and he's coming off the edge, getting sacks, and showing that he's tough to stop in that role, then I think the value goes up for him.
Yeah, I mean, based off of kind of his body of work in the NFL, you pay him like a traditional linebacker. The highest for that in the NFL right now is actually a very Anthony Barr-like player, Jamie Collins, at $12.5 million. But traditional linebackers, they just don't make as much as pass rushers do, right? I mean, like $20 million, we're getting to that point. Mm-hmm. So if they end up putting him in a role where he genuinely ends up rushing the passer a lot more, maybe gets more than 5 sacks or something like that, that would be probably great for his bank account, but conversely very difficult for the Vikings to be able to bring in. And if they end up being able to negotiate a traditional linebacker salary for him, I think they have the ability to keep him. I think even though it seems tight now, I think they'd be able to absorb, it might be a $12 million hit, right? A pretty high percentage, or a pretty high total, but pretty low percentage of the cap relative to what other linebackers do. So I wouldn't be surprised. But if they end up having to deal with an agent that thinks that they can extract his pass rushing value on the open market for more, it would be difficult to keep him, and he is a pretty unique piece in the defense, and so it'd be difficult to replace him too.
And that's why what you said there at the end is exactly why this whole situation is very interesting to me, and kind of has been for the last few years, of him not getting a lot of sacks and not really even getting a ton of pass rushing snaps. I mean, for other guys who play they might be in a nickel too, but guys who are more of outside linebackers, they will be rushing all the time on a consistent basis, where he profiles much more like a traditional inside linebacker because he's only rushing about 100 times out of 1,000 snaps. It was only 11% of the time where he was actually rushing. So I kind of go back and forth on this because I could totally see him being great at it. I mean, for 6'4", 6'5" guy, that's very rare for the inside linebacker to be that tall and lanky. So you would think, and based on what he did in college, he could be really excellent at this. But at the same time, I feel like as we go along into the season and things get tight, that Zimmer may go back to kind of what he sees him as. And then if you're Anthony Barr, you might not exactly be thrilled with that, right? If you're going to have me be that inside linebacker, I'm not going to get paid as much.
Right, yeah. And, it's kind of difficult, right? Because, in order for him to be valuable to the Vikings, he needs to make that defense look good, and if he freelances or does something else, it's going to be difficult. Or if he kind of demands a role that the defense, it just doesn't fit for what the defense needs to do, he won't be as valuable to the Vikings. But at the same time, it's really important for him to find those opportunities to increase his value. And there's probably ways where you can, do both, but it's still pretty difficult. And it's easy for someone who's been successful, like Mike Zimmer, to rely on what has been successful. Like you mentioned, he took very few pass rush snaps this year relative to his career. And he's actually taken, I think, it's almost linear. I think he's taken fewer pass rush snaps every single year. And what's really interesting is the percentage of snaps where he does pass rush, the amount of pressure he generates has actually also kind of decreased year by year, which I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some relationship.
My guess would be just the adjustment to the double-A gap.
I think that would play probably a pretty big role too. It's a tough situation for him because, he wants to make the defense look good to be valuable to the team that he's currently on, but he knows that he can be a pass rusher. That's what he was at UCLA. The weight that he was coming out of college is actually the exact same weight Danielle Hunter was, 255 pounds. And so, like you mentioned, he's a 6'5" guy, 255 pounds. He might have gained or lost weight since entering the league, but we know that he can pass rush at that weight. He does profile, like you say, as a potential edge rusher, and if he can find those snaps and make the most of those snaps, then, he can argue that he should be treated like a Von Miller or Khalil Mack, like a guy that rushes off the edge and is productive off the edge, but can play a lot of coverage, can play a lot of traditional linebacker roles if you need him to, but that's not their main jobs. And maybe for him and his agent, maybe he doesn't think that should be his main job either.
I'm wondering what it might mean schematically if he's coming off the edge more often, to how teams will handle that. I mean, instead of having the two linebackers there, I think where it made them really good was against running backs coming out of the backfield, where either way you were going. The Pittsburgh game, they were actually really good in the Pittsburgh game, aside from some pass interference calls and one mix-up between Terrence Newman and somebody else that led to a touchdown.
Right.
But slowing down Le'Veon Bell coming out of the backfield, it seemed like either way he would come out, you would have a linebacker there who was chasing him down. And when Barr is at his best, he's quick enough to get into the flat. I'm thinking of week 1 where he blew up Alvin Kamara in the backfield.
Right.
That he can be really excellent at that. So for Zimmer, if he's going to do this, I still see it as a balance where he's not just going to be lining up there all the time, that it's probably just going to be situational.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if this was almost exclusively like a third down package, or if it's something where Barr or the entire defense adjusts based on the running back alignment. If the alert is based off of their alignment that they're not very likely to have the running back go out into the flat or something along those lines, then you might just have Barr. I think it's called Green Dog. Where you evaluate what the running back is doing before you blitz. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they had multiple checks in the defense that kind of adjust what the defense does based off what they think is likely because of their film study. But I think primarily they'll be thinking about this as kind of a third down response. And you're right, shutting down those running backs has been a really big part of their defensive success. It's a very common response to the Vikings being able to get pressure so quickly and cover receivers downfield. And so Kendricks and Barr have been instrumental in being able to prevent those runs to the flat. So they need to, like you said, balance that out. And I think maybe the best way to balance that out is to isolate his pass rushing instances to moments where that's just not going to matter.
And for that reason, what you're talking about of being able to stop those running backs, that's why I saw Eric Kendricks as a guy that would be vital to make sure they kept, because he's just so good at that. I think he's among the best in the league at closing quickly when someone is coming out into the flat. And you rarely see, I mean, he had a few broken tackles last year in the Detroit game, but I mean, he's a good tackler and he's so quick that I don't even mind anymore if my linebacker isn't this big guy who's just breathing fire.
Right.
I would prefer to have him almost be a hybrid safety in today's game.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we know that, you and I agree that purely running the ball is actually not all that valuable. Maybe there's some value in terms of, making the defense do this or that, or sort of like the kind of the game theory value in the long term. But in the short term, it is better to stop a running back pass than a running back run. And so, having a linebacker who's capable of blowing up those screens ends up being more important, especially if you've got someone as consistent as Kendricks being able to do that, especially because we've seen, the Vikings blitz off the edge with their defensive backs, slot corner, safeties, and, apparently linebackers now. And the big response that a lot of teams have had to that is instead of throwing hot to tight ends or throwing quick to receivers, they do a lot of running back screens. And so Kendricks has been really important in nailing that down. And that might be why it had been easier to get that deal with Kendricks than it was to get that deal with Barr.
So if they don't sign Anthony Barr, and I mean, I know we're talking way down the road here, and there is a 2018 season coming up, so there's that. But if they don't sign Anthony Barr long term, you can replace that guy, right? I mean, that's the way that I kind of look at. He comes into the league and everyone's excited about what he's going to be. And I think that was fair because he was so good, especially in 2015. But over the last 2 years, when you try to look at the game distribution of just how many good games he had, how many bad games, how many sort of not that noticeable games, there have probably been as many good games as bad games for him over the last 2 seasons. And if you're talking about investing that much and then thinking about future decisions, you're going to end up with conversations like, well, do we have to cut important people, or can we not fill out our depth in one spot or another? I feel like they're already sacrificing the depth positions. They're not a team that went out and signed some veteran backup safety. Right. They're a team that has consistently relied on those younger guys to be their backups, or someone like Anthony Harris who's paid almost nothing. And they're going to have to do even more of that as they go forward if they sign Anthony Barr to a huge deal, and then it becomes really, really tricky of how to keep everybody. Yeah.
So the first scenario where they don't get Anthony Barr, it would be super difficult to find a way to replace it. If you take a look at the linebackers in free agency in 2019, which, I mean, generally that's a pretty stupid practice before the 2018 season has occurred. But if you take a look at, which of those linebackers exist, not a ton of them have Anthony Barr's skills that if you coach them up in a particular way that they could kind of replicate his role. Maybe Michael Kendricks, who they did try to bring in, who ended up signing a 1-year deal with the Browns. He physically has a lot of the capabilities that Anthony Barr has, plus you've got the fun little story of him and his brother.
Has anyone ever written about that?
I can't imagine.
His brother's in the league, huh?
Yeah, his brother's in the league. Plays for a Midwestern team of some sort.
Is Adam Thielen, where's he from?
Upper Midwest, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, we haven't heard a lot about his origin story either.
Sorry, that is just too far off. They would probably then draft his replacement, right?
They would try to. And what's really nice is that there are, as kind of the NFL has evolved, there have been more linebackers entering the NFL that are kind of closer to that skill set. It's still kind of difficult to find those guys. I think there's one name that's popped up. I've actually asked about this. There's one name that's popped up that might have Anthony Barr's physical size characteristics. I don't know that he was used like this in college, and it's a name I know that you love. His name is actually Josh Allen. He's a linebacker from Kentucky. This is a real person. He's 6'5", 260 pounds.
I think you're mistaken.
Oh. But yeah,
I think we're going to have to end this.
He's a real person who actually has that name. But yeah, he could be interesting.
Sorry, where's he from?
Well, he goes to college in Kentucky. I don't know where he's from. Sorry, that was maybe a little too smart of me. But yeah, he's somebody to keep an eye on in the draft. While there have been more players that have been kind of closer to Anthony Barr's physical skill set entering the draft the past couple of years, it's still kind of a tall order to try and find someone in the draft to replace him, especially because you're going to probably end up spending a first-round pick, and the Vikings already have a couple of first-round pick priorities probably. It's a really rich defensive tackle draft, probably, and they might want to replace Shelton Richardson instead of extend him. They still don't have a guard. And so they might want to get one of those in possibly the first or the second. And when you start adding on to that, it becomes very difficult to maintain that level of defensive performance.
So I guess the way that I've looked at that is I agree with you that the skills for Anthony Barr, being that he was drafted as high as he was, and his height, quickness, all those things combination is really hard to replace. The production over the last 2 years, though, I would argue is not as hard to replace. That he was good at times last year. First 5 games, I think he was one of the best linebackers in the NFL, but then it sort of tailed off again. And in 2016, I believe he was battling an injury. At the same time, there were way too many games where he was questionable, and that's where I kind of would hesitate to give the amount of money that you're talking about when it's someone who has been kind of mid-pack at what he does, as opposed to what his skills are, that he can be at the very top of the game. And the fact that you already have Kendricks locked up there, he would have been the more valuable guy to me to lock up because of that passing game. But that will be something that you're right. Do you want to spend all the money and then hurt yourself potentially later? Or do you want to open up a pretty gaping hole in your really great defense? That's going to be a difficult decision for them. Let's go, unless you have something more.
No, let's go.
Flip over to the offensive line. I think draft night is evening, late afternoon.
A moment.
That we are going to go back to over and over and over and over again.
Constantly.
All the time. And especially if Will Hernandez is any good. Or even some of the guys that were drafted in the second round, like Connor Williams, where you could have traded up to get them. Letting all of those offensive linemen go off the board and getting Brian O'Neill in the second round. When there's even somebody gets a paper cut and has to miss a rep, and you see what that offensive line could look like without Mike Remmers in there, like we saw today, it looks like it could be one of the worst lines in the NFL if anyone is out.
Right, yeah. Assuming the Chargers curse is over and they don't lose any offensive linemen again, I would think that the Vikings are maybe they could be close to that in contention for that if say Elflein's injury is worse or it re-aggravates and then someone else goes out. You end up with like 2 guards that you didn't even intend on maybe even having on the roster before the draft started. So yeah, I think a lot of people point to it. And the thing is, the player that they drafted, Mike Hughes, all indications thus far, based on kind of the honest assessments we get from Mike Zimmer and what he's looked like in training camp and stuff like that, sounds like Mike Hughes is really phenomenal, and he's playing much better than you'd expect a rookie to play, especially in the system. But it's not going to mean much if he's just like on the bench the entire year. Maybe the Vikings execute a crazy trade. They trade away like Mackenzie Alexander or Trey Waynes, and then Mike Hughes can start. And then
Don't be in my mentions.
And then
that.
finally you can get a guard. And
that is my
who has extra guards?
Oh yeah, you had some good tweets on that too.
Yeah,
the same people have been tweeting and emailing everyone. Can they trade for a starting guard? Like, are people just trading starting guards?
Yeah, for cornerback twos that have only had one good year.
Video games, you could definitely do that.
Yeah. But aside from that, Mike Hughes is going to be on the bench, and the guy that they could have gotten in the first round, or if they traded back or whatever, they could have gotten with that pick, could end up performing well. And it's really weird, actually. The Browns, who drafted, I think, Austin Corbett, who the Vikings had their eyes on, they now have 2 left guards and no left tackles and are now forcing one of them to play left tackle. And it's like, man, could have really just switched you both screwed it up.
Right. Can we just have your guard just send him over, please? He went higher than they expected. And that and one of the reasons that we will keep going back to it is because of what Rick Spielman said on draft night, where he
never seen a run like that before.
Yeah, right. It was like, you guys didn't see that coming? The draft analysts had been talking about it forever. I mean, so I didn't see Corbett being that high either, but still, they had been saying over and over again, guard value is up. There's a ton of great guards. They're all going to go in the second round. Even the draft simulator that I love so much.
Yeah.
It's really funny because the exact scenario that happened to me with the draft simulator, and I took Brian O'Neill. And that's where that did happen once. I was like, wow, this is really exactly what happened. But with O'Neill, he is getting some really valuable experience.
Yeah. And what's really, I guess, fun about him is that he's doing kind of all of the things that you'd kind of expect based off of his scouting report. So when they do these drills for the offensive linemen, they're not competing against each other, but they're performing them at the same time. And they're not directly offensive line drills. They're touch the cone, move here, move here. He's clearly the most flexible, the fastest, moving off the ball really well. And then, they've got him in some of these, more offensive line oriented drills. And in some of them, he looks amazing. He's doing a really good job getting off the block, locking his hip, moving to the second level, offensive line words. He's doing a lot of great, stuff. And then, and sometimes in the 11-on-11s and the 1-on-1s, he's looking pretty good. But then at other times, he looks like he has very recently learned to play offensive line,
right?
Which turns out to be a thing that is true about him. And so, maybe, and Zimmer might be in a tough spot because, he mentioned earlier today, we want to play the best 5 offensive linemen. Well, Rashad Hill hasn't been looking great, and Brian O'Neill is maybe not ready. But Brian O'Neill may already be playing better than Rashad Hill, but if you play him too early, you could ingrain some bad habits that are going to affect him for maybe the rest of his career. And so do you really want to stick to best 5? And if you're having these questions, maybe your draft strategy was not great in the first place. Yeah, it's a mess.
So I was thinking this exact same thing that you just brought up when DeFilippo, 2 John DeFilippo quotes. So I asked him in minicamp what he thought of Rashad Hill, and his answer was about 6 words long. And you've seen the transcript, and you've been sitting there for John DeFilippo. Tell me how many 6-word answers you've ever seen. He goes on forever.
Yeah, he
which
loves
is great.
talking.
It's great.
Yeah, but when it's 6 words,
that really sent off some alarm bells in my head. Oh my gosh! All he said was, he's trying pretty hard and he's making progress. He couldn't think of a really good compliment to give Rashad Hill, which. He's a backup tackle, and that's probably why. And he doesn't really move all that well. So if DeFilippo's offense wants his offensive lineman to move all the time, even if Brian O'Neill is going to get bull rushed right back into Kirk Cousins at a lot of times, I think, with him right now, especially watching him play in college, there were a lot of situations where he was being just pushed right back into the quarterback. But they might say, well, if we're running all of these screens and things like that, he'd be a right tackle who can pull anytime we want him to. And you compare that, his ability to get to the second level, to Rashad Hill, where he doesn't have any ability to get to the second level. Maybe the ups outweigh the downs in some cases, and think of Nick Easton last year. With Nick Easton, he could get bull rushed too, but the ups outweighed the downs for them, and they decided to have him be the starting guard.
Yeah, I don't think the Vikings are very happy about their tackle situation, I think they knew going in to the offseason that they would not end up being very happy about their tackle situation. But it's related to the guard question. If they had gotten a guard, Mike Remmers plays right tackle.
And Mike Remmers very well still could end up playing right tackle.
Yeah, it might be better
if this goes really badly. Would you rather have Remmers at right tackle and a bad guard, or Remmers at guard and a bad tackle? I would rather have the bad guard.
Yeah, I think so. It's very appealing to think about it as best 5. But, and I used to be kind of on the other side of this where I thought guards were like super undervalued and tackles were a little bit overvalued. You get, interior pressure matters more. But you've talked a lot to Pro Football Focus's Eric Eager. After talking to him, he brought up a lot of really good evidence that when you take a tackle out of a game, the impact it has on a team's winning percentage is greater than if you take a guard out of a game. And then through another method of basically proving this, interior pressure, which happens less often anyway, is less valuable than edge pressure, which happens more often in the first place. Mm-hmm. So it really is maybe just better to have a bad guard and an okay tackle than to have two below average players at that position.
And we are early in camp. Last year we ended camp and still ended up with different offensive linemen that we had seen for the very last practice. They cut Alex Boone and then they shuffle things around. And so I would say that if you were putting odds on all of this, that's a scenario that gets a pretty good percentage of your bettors, is saying that Remmers ends up back out at right tackle. And I think at this very moment, I think that's the best way to go. Put Isidore in there or put Tom Compton if you have to at your right guard when Elflein comes back. And that may be where you have to go. Let me ask you before we wrap up about regression. I'm writing a piece for tomorrow about this. You love regression. It's your friend. So Bill Barnwell wrote that the Vikings are a prime candidate to drop back. Yeah, and of course you are when you win 13 games.
Yeah.
So I went looking.
The Patriots are. The Vegas has them dropping.
Everyone who wins 13 or 14 games, 15, you're always going to be dropping back. Yeah. I mean, that's natural. But how far you drop back is what is going to matter here. And there are scenarios you could run where you'd see the Vikings winning 12 or 13 games again. Mm-hmm. And there are also scenarios because of this offensive line and because the defense had no injuries last year and could possibly
least
this year.
Least injured defense in the league.
With not a whole lot of depth anywhere, where they drop back quite a bit when you add the schedule into it and Aaron Rodgers being back and all that. What do you see as the high end and low end of all of the possibilities here when you run 1,000 scenarios, say, with your computer that's in front of us? Please do that right this second if you could.
Beep, boop, beep. So I actually wrote a piece on the likelihood of defensive regression a little bit earlier in the offseason. And one of the things that comes up, obviously, the Vikings are the least injured defense, not just in the league last year, but I think over the past 5 years, using Football Outsiders' adjusted games lost metric. And so it is very unlikely that they'll be able to continue that streak of health. But on the other side, there are actually indicators of where they should actually do a little bit better. They were not that great at takeaways, and that's something that's very subject to regression. Coaches preach turnovers a lot, but turnovers are only partially a product of performance. And so the Vikings are more likely than not to increase the amount of turnovers they generate on defense. There's a couple of other indicators of positive regression, too. Injury is the most important, but a bunch of the other indicators go the other way. Offensively, I'm a little worried. You mentioned the offensive line. That's one reason. I think also, I don't think there's any question that Kirk Cousins is a better quarterback than Case Keenum, but that's a question about who will do better in the 2018 season. I think it is very unlikely that Cousins will be able to replicate the passing performance that Keenum cobbled together, mostly from luck. That's something I think
and screens.
For the 2017 season. I mean, it was a very efficient passing offense, especially all things considered, that will be difficult to replicate. So Cousins could just be a better quarterback. The Vikings, maybe made the right decision and all that. But still, the passing game could regress because last year's passing game was built off of a lot of luck. I think that there's a really good chance that the Vikings regress, partially because of defensive injuries, partially because of the offensive passing game, and partially because of the offensive line. But I do think that we don't want to overlook all the other indicators that show that maybe they won't regress. I mean, their winning percentage in games by over a touchdown, the turnover and takeaway differential, et cetera, et cetera.
Where I think they will is just the schedule. I mean, I think the schedule is a nightmare when you look at all the quarterbacks they have to face. And people will get hurt. Quarterbacks get hurt too. But not having to face Aaron Rodgers for 2 games is huge. And Mitch Trubisky, I'm not a buyer yet, but he sure has better weapons and a better coach than he had before, so it'll be a tougher challenge. Wilson, the Rams offense, Tom Brady, I mean, Drew Brees, Carson Wentz coming back. You have a murderer's row of quarterbacks that I don't think you really had last year, and that will probably even some of it out too. I would still bet on them to be a really good defense, but I went back to the year 2000 for Conan O'Brien fans. I know what you're saying in your head, the year 2000. And I found 3 instances of a team going back-to-back number 1 in yards. And it was Pittsburgh twice and then Seattle, which was 2013-14, and no one has done it since. So there's also that. There's also, like, this league is set up so it's really hard to repeat these things from year to year to year. So even though I still think they have the same amount of talent, I would tend to lean toward, yes, they will drop back a little bit, but it would be regressing to the still awesome. And
right, yeah.
What's going to depend on whether you win or lose in a lot of ways. And this would almost be like, I'm going to go like anti-analytics take here.
Oh, wow.
Watch this.
Football.
Does your quarterback win games?
Oh, geez.
Is your quarterback a winner here? Because I'm telling you, I think that's what it comes down to with how does this team handle...
Explains your anti-Tyrod takes.
How does this team... Well, and I can explain watching Tyrod games where it was right there to win. His first year in 2014...
Just doesn't want it enough.
There were like 6 games where Tyrod Taylor lost by a score because he couldn't drive the ball at the end of a game. Because when teams knew he was going to pass, they could stop him. And with...
Close games, wow, subject to regression.
With Cousins... But it didn't with Tyrod Taylor. He continued to do that. And there are some quarterbacks, as we saw, Sam Bradford was one of them, who career-wise do struggle with this. Cousins is kind of up and down throughout his career with the situational stuff and things like that. But for 2018 alone, what you could see is they've got really tough schedule, a lot of really great quarterbacks who they're going to hold to lesser performances than usual because their defense is great, and you're going to be in those games, and it's going to be a lot of, is Kirk Cousins a winner here in 2018? That doesn't mean for his whole life he's a winner or a loser, but he will be in a lot of situations where it's going to be on him to make a play, make a throw that wins them a game, and that could ultimately be the difference.
Yeah, so I actually do think that there's a couple of strains of truth here, so I'm not going to clown you too much. But when you take a look at some of the quarterbacks that are known for performing well late in games, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, etc., they end up producing more wins in late game situations where they're down by a score, entering the final drives or something like that. But their passer rating under pressure or passer rating in those final minutes, they're not as good as some quarterbacks that are not as well known for winning those games. People like Aaron Rodgers and Tony Romo, although Aaron Rodgers has kind of fixed that reputation the past couple of years. And the reason for that might be because, and this is maybe the Aaron Rodgers problem, we actually saw this today in training camp where they're too scared to make really difficult throws and trust themselves to do that. Now, Rodgers the past couple of years, he's gotten over that, and his record in close games or in games with the final drive has kind of bounced back, but he's also made many, many more aggressive throws, and I think it was a response to not winning those games despite having like a high completion percentage in those situations. And you need to be able to throw some interceptions or throw some throws that would be turned into interceptions, and I don't think Cousins does that late in games where you need to drive. Like, you need to be able to throw riskier throws and have your receivers kind of make the play for you instead of taking a bunch of short gains. And the 2-minute drill that we saw today, that all had, like, he made a bunch of really short passes, didn't make any risky passes, drained the timeouts, and then we go to the 10 seconds left, and he's supposed to spike it. And with or without the aborted snap that ended the 2-minute drill / the game where they were down by 5 points in the situation, they wouldn't have had enough time anyway, and that's because of all the short passes. And I think that this is something we saw in Cousins games too, where they don't change what they need to do to respond to the situation.
That's something we saw from Sam Bradford. If Sam Bradford was down by 10 points in the fourth quarter and it was 3rd and 7, there's a good chance he throws a 3-yard underneath route to Kyle Rudolph. Because in a bubble, that play is fine. Like, okay,
right.
Well, you took what you could get, and maybe he runs after the catch. not Kyle Rudolph necessarily, but right? I mean, though, like from a philosophical, let's look at a single play, and you went from
and
read
divorce
to read
it from
to read.
the context,
right?
Yeah.
And that's what you need to do. But Bradford had the arm to make special plays all over the field and just wouldn't do it a lot of times. It was, and the same thing with Tyrod Taylor. You saw this a lot. If he got ahead, well, he could just run away from a team where he would just have a great day and he'd make all sorts of throws. But if he wasn't getting ahead and teams especially knew he was going to pass, that's what they're trying to get you to do, is to go underneath like that. And he would kind of take what he could get, but that doesn't necessarily win you the game. So that's where with Cousins, I will be interested to see, like, is his confidence more now? I mean, he's got a team that has poured $84 million into him and said, we believe in you. Like, no matter what Washington said, no matter what Arif Hasan of Zone Coverage has written, doesn't matter. We are giving you all the money you ever dreamed of because we buy into you as being able to do that. There may be some sort of psychological effect there. I would think that even just having myself gone from one place of employment where I felt like they didn't really want to pay me what I was worth to another one where I feel great, this one, it changes. It really does change how you feel about where you are. And I'm curious if there's something ingrained there entirely with him, or he feels pressure because of that, or if he feels confidence because of that. And whatever the results are, I will just assume that I was right about it, like which one it was.
Yeah,
I'll just assign, I'll take the results and assign, well, he must have been more confident. That's what I mean. but it's going to be one of the most entertaining and interesting things to watch, how he reacts to fully having a team buy into him. Let me just ask you one question before we wrap up. Great stuff, as always. Rank your top, do it, 5 NFC teams right now.
Oh, geez.
I've got them on my cellular device. If you can't think of the teams, there's the little logos.
Who is in the NFC?
Who's in the NFC football?
So the first name that I see, because it's the first one here, Philadelphia. Let's put that as my top NFC team.
Okay.
Seems safe. Never heard of them before, but that seems safe.
Have they played against the Vikings at all recently?
Not that I can remember. If I pull up the season schedule, it doesn't look like I see the Eagles. So
okay, so this will be a first then. It'll be brand new, coach v. coach.
Right. Why are we like this? Then probably number 2, I'd say the Saints. Really great pieces on defense. Maybe have to fix the linebackers. I've heard they've got a good quarterback. So that'll help.
I still feel sad for Drew. It was a great comeback. He deserved credit for it.
No, that's true. Yeah, he did a really great job. I just kind of blew past that. Sorry. And then after that, I guess the Minnesota Vikings. I guess. And then I should pick the Rams. I just don't believe in Goff. I'll pick the Falcons and then the Rams.
Not religious, huh? Oh, Goff.
You got me.
That's the perfect way for me to end this podcast. So
then wild card the 49ers.
Let me just, I will say, I will agree with you on Philadelphia. I don't think a ton has changed, really.
Yeah.
And they're still going to be great. And then it gets really hairy because I want to have Green Bay in the conversation here too.
It's tough. I mean, there's a lot of room for their defense to get better fast. Yes. I really trust the defensive coordinator. I do think they've got a lot of good defensive pieces that were just misused. Plus, their draft was really stupidly phenomenal, thanks to actually another member of this list, the Saints.
Right, the trade.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of room for them to get better fast, but the NFC's crowded.
Yep, and I think the sneaky team that sort of isn't getting talked about a lot would probably be Atlanta. Like, I wonder if they go back the other direction. But read Arif's work at zonecoverage.ca because he's big in Canada. No, just kidding. Zonecoverage.com and follow him, Arif Hasan NFL. That's correct?
Yeah.
At your own risk, really. Follow you on Twitter. No, great stuff on your Twitter account for Vikings training camp and things like that. So I appreciate you taking all the time, and we will talk to you all again soon on the Purple Podcast.
All right.
Love a good deal? Sail into the season at Banana Republic Factory's Mega Labor Day Sale. Entire store 50 to 70% off. Dresses from $19.99, polos from $14.99. It's insane. Grab your friends. Banana Republic Factory. See you there.
Napa know-how. Keeping it simple is usually a good thing. And when it comes to rewards programs, keeping it simple is always a good thing. That's why we made the NAPA Rewards program effortless. All you need is your phone number to start saving on the parts and tools you need. Then we automatically give you $5 off your next purchase for every 100 you spend. So start saving today with NAPA Rewards. Quality parts, helpful people. That's NAPA know-how.
NAPA know-how.
I'm Rita Foley with an AP News Minute. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis was there to greet the McCain family last night as Senator and war hero John McCain's body was flown to a military base outside Washington. Today, McCain's body will lie in state under the Capitol Rotunda. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Magani.
After a memorial service yesterday in his adopted home of Arizona, a military jet flew McCain's body east to Joint Base Andrews, where he was greeted with an armed forces tribute. He's now lying in state at the U.S. Capitol, where he's served for so many years, and where the public will be allowed to file in on what's expected to be a stormy day here in Washington. McCain will be buried Sunday.
Ariana Grande and Stevie Wonder will sing, and former President Clinton will speak at Aretha Franklin's funeral today in Detroit. But organizers promise this will be a service, not a show. An American man's pleaded not guilty to assault in Uganda after video footage showed him punching a hotel worker. I'm Rita Foley.